Yeah, well, thanks, Joseph, and yeah, thanks for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, virtually. So I'm going to talk about cover crops and organic cropping systems. Like Joseph said, I'm at Cornell. I'm an associate professor in soil and crop sciences, and I teach undergraduate students about sustainable cropping systems and organic agriculture. I do field research. I work with farmers, organic farmers, non-organic farmers. Do a lot of research on cover crops out at the Musgrave Research Farm. So as we go through, I have my contact information here, my email. I'm going to show you some data from different papers that we've worked on and some other results. And if you would like any more additional information about anything I'm sharing with you, please don't hesitate, email me. I'd be happy to send you copies of the PDFs of the papers and talk with you more about any of the stuff that we're going to touch on today. So. I also have a website here, a link to our Sustainable Cropping Systems website. I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in this stuff. And as we go along, if anyone has questions, please, I'm not really going to be able to monitor the chat box there or anything, but if there are questions, just call them out and we'll take a moment and go through things and address. I'll share these slides with Joseph when we're done, and I think they'll be available to you. So let's get started here. So I wanted to start off with just some acknowledgements. I'm going to show you data from projects that have involved a number of different people here. So some close collaborators and graduate students in the lab are highlighted here or bolded. I want to just shout out to the New York Ag and Markets Program, the Environmental Protection Fund, and that funds us through the New York Soil Health Program. Also, the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, USDA, NEPA. We've been getting funding from different sources for this work here. While I have you, and just before I forget, I wanted to put in a plug for the Northeast Cover Crops Council. I'm on the planning committee for the upcoming conference, and this is a virtual conference. If you're not familiar with the Northeast Cover Crops Council, it is a relatively new organization modeled after the Midwest Cover Crop Council. And we have been meeting for the past several years, and we were supposed to meet up in Vermont in March, but the event will now be virtual because of the pandemic. Nonetheless, I think it'll be a really good opportunity to learn about what other people are doing in the Northeast with cover crops. And there's also this video contest if you're interested in submitting a video for that. So I'm going to talk about organic crop production and cover crops. And I wanted to start off with this slide here because crop production, organic crop production is different than conventional crop production. And some of the priorities and reasons why organic farmers use cover crops is different than why the majority of other farmers would be using cover crops. And so what I'm showing you here are these, just got to get rid of this thing here. Yeah, what I'm showing you here are some data from a survey of farmers. And so there were 265 organic farmers, 75 conventional farmers. And we asked them the question, well, why do you grow cover crops? And they could select as many reasons as they wanted here. And so what we're seeing is that there is a difference. So number one, both organic and conventional, we see that, improving soil health is a top priority for them, and the reason why they use cover crops, increasing soil organic matter. And as you go down, the overall, the combined score or frequency here goes down. But when you look, you see these stars here, these asterisks, that's where there's a difference between the organic in that darker gray bar and conventional farmers in the lighter gray bar. So organic farmers are very interested in soil health, a bit more than conventional farmers that we surveyed, also interested in increasing soil organic matter as a reason for using cover crops. And then these other two big ones here, weed suppression and nitrogen fixation. Now, because of the constraints with the National Organic Program and some of the limitations that organic farmers have in terms of not being able to use some synthetic inputs, they are really looking for cover crops as a tool to replace herbicides, to replace tillage, so forth, but also to provide nitrogen, because they are not using ammoniated Haber-Bosch nitrogen. So those are two really big constraints, I would say, in organic production. weed suppression and providing enough nitrogen. The other big issue with organic farmers is the emphasis on tillage for mainly for weed suppression. And so I feel like that comes out in this survey with these data. So I'm going to be spending the majority of the time today talking about ways to use cover crops to facilitate reductions in tillage in organic cropping systems. But I just wanted to touch on these two other components here, weed suppression and nitrogen fixation, because there are some other approaches to using cover crops that are also very useful and that can be helpful for those organic farmers. So I'm showing you some photographs here. Up in the upper left-hand corner, we have hairy vetch, and then we have red clover to the right, some cover crop interseeding, and then organic soybean that was no-till planted into a rolled rye cover crop. And so in terms of providing nitrogen, there are some great options with cover crops. Hairy vetch is quite winter hardy. It can be planted and overwinter, more than winter pea and crimson clover, and it can provide quite a bit of nitrogen to your following corn crop, for example. Red clover can also do the same. Certainly in a rotation with winter wheat, you can frost seed red clover, and that's very common for organic farmers in the region. And then they would basically manage that red clover and have it overwinter after that wheat is harvested, and then plow it down before corn. And a lot of organic farmers are getting the majority of their nitrogen for their corn with red clover like that. There are some concerns with using hairy vetch, particularly with farmers that do grow small grains like wheat, because it has potential to become a weed, and that's because of its dormancy and the hard seed that it has. And so I'm involved in a breeding project, a national breeding project, looking at hairy vetch, winter pea, and also crimson clover, and trying to develop varieties for organic farmers. And the main trait that we're looking for with our hairy vetch work is reduced hard seediness. That's a major focus of what we're looking at. And then also with crimson clover and winter pea, we're looking at winter hardiness. And so crimson clover and winter pea, depending on where you are in New York, will or will not overwinter. And so we're looking at ways, really putting them in some cold environments and trying to select for genotypes that can do well under very cold conditions. So I'm really not going to spend too much time talking about hairy vetch or red clover, but I did want to highlight those in the beginning. I have done some work with cover crop interseeding, and what I'm showing you in the lower right there is a cover crop mixture that was drill interseeded into organic corn. And we looked at different corn densities to see if we can reduce our density and still maintain good yield, but provide a little bit more light transmittance through the canopy to get that cover crop established. And we do see some opportunities there. You may be able to, depending on the variety that you're using, if it's a flex type of variety, you may be able to drop your rate a little bit and not take a yield hit, but also get some benefits in terms of that cover crop. In this particular work, we saw quite a substantial reduction in weed biomass in our plots that we were interseeding into compared to our no cover crop control plots. So if you're an organic farmer and you're having some weed problems, cover crop interseeding might be beneficial. And what's really nice is that sometimes with organic corn production, especially if you're using cultivation, sometimes your stand or your population isn't as even as you want it to be. There's either sometimes gaps, or you have an area where maybe the cultivator got too close to the row, and having a cover crop there is really beneficial, because if you have a gap and some extra light transmittance through the canopy, it's much better to have a cover crop going than having weeds grow. So for the rest of the talk here, I'm really going to focus on this system where we're using rolled cover crops, in this case cereal rye, that's mechanically terminated with a roller crimper, and to facilitate no-till soybean production. And so I've done a lot of work on this system here, and I think there's a lot of potential with this. And so we'll talk about that. And then at the end, I'll show you some slides, some new work looking at other crops that we can potentially no-till into a rolled cover crop situation like that. So don't feel like some of this may be review or just basic, straightforward information, but there are some serious problems with soil tillage, and it is a quite commonly used in organic production. Without herbicides, organic farmers often use tillage and cultivation for weed management, incorporating manure, other amendments, but it leaves soil susceptible to erosion. You can see the corn that was just planted in this field here, and then after a heavy rainfall event, there's quite a bit of washing, degrades soil health, right? It also requires a lot of labor and fuel. So a lot of organic farmers, they are very much in tune and want good soil health. They really don't want to be using a moldboard plow, and for multiple reasons, including the labor and the fuel cost. But they're really stuck with it because they don't have better options. And so that's one issue that we're trying to address with my research program, and trying to provide them with some other alternatives to using moldboard plow tillage for establishing row crops like soybean and even corn. So this is the system that we're really interested in here. We're using a roller crimper, and so this is a photograph of the I&J roller crimper. In this model is 10 feet wide. It weighs approximately 2,600 pounds when it's filled up with water. And so we're going in and rolling down that cover crop, that right cover crop, and then you can see the soybean that has emerged through it, growing quite vigorously, and very good weed suppression. Typically, when we have that much biomass going down on the ground like that. Previous work has also looked at using hairy vetch and no-till planting corn into it, and so this is a photograph with a one-pass operation where that roller crimper is front mounted to a tractor, and then in a single pass you're terminating cover crop and also no-till planting your cash crop. Okay, so this photograph is from Pennsylvania. I don't have a lot of photographs from New York with this particular system with corn into hairy vetch, and I found coming from Pennsylvania up into New York with my research that it is a bit more challenging. One of the reasons why it's challenging in New York to do organic no-till corn is because of the shorter growing season and the need to wait for flowering or early pod really with hairy vetch to be able to mechanically terminate it with that roller crimper. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here. Previous work comparing and looking at how this system works and compares to traditional organic management. You can see up on the photographs on the top, typically looking at moldboard plowing, disking, doing some cultipacking, maybe some field cultivation, and then blind cultivation, and then inter-row cultivation. So there's quite a number of passes, but also a lot of disturbance to the soil, a lot of opportunities for soil erosion, soil degradation. Certainly when it's wet, if you're needing to till and or if you're prevented from going out in the field, there's either a trade-off with either a potential reduction in soil health and some compaction, or just if you don't do it, potential for weed problems. And if you miss a cultivation event, you can certainly get yourself into trouble. And so we're trying to replace this type of management here with this rotational no-till approach. And I really want to emphasize that all of this work that we've been doing in the system, it has been rotational no-till. It's not a continuous no-till system. Tillage is often used for establishing the cover crop, okay? And so we thought that has been important for managing perennial weeds. The mulch from the cover crops is really good at managing small-seeded annual weeds, but for perennial weeds, some tillage at some point in the rotation is really beneficial. So if you can imagine, what we're doing is really replacing this tillage event and moving this one to the fall, but we're getting away from this inter-row cultivation. So it's still a reduction in labor. And when we've modeled this out and looked at this, we see a reduction of 31% less labor, 27% less diesel fuel, and then also some environmental benefits as well as reduced energy use and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fewer passes that are used with this rotational no-till approach. We also have looked at in some research in New York, we've looked at comparing different cereal rye management practices before organic soybean production. And when we have rolled down this rye cover crop and no-till planted soybean into it, we see that when compared to a no cover crop control, we see improved soil health and really in the form of increased soil respiration, increased water infiltration, and certainly protection from soil erosion. So just some research from New York that I wanted to highlight there related to some soil health indicators. You can see here, this is one of the main reasons we've been seeing an increase due to climate change, an increase in the frequency of these extreme rainfall events where you get a lot of rain over a very short period of time. And having your soil covered with a mulch like that is really beneficial, and it can avoid situations like this where you have washouts and some soil erosion damage to your fields. So I want to talk about compatibility with cash crops. One mistake that we often see with that some farmers have made in the past, and this is more of an issue really with organic production, but matching your cover crop with your cash crop that you're growing. And in organic production systems, we're really trying to take a multi-pronged integrated approach to weed management. And so certainly much of the weed management is just coming from that physical barrier, that mulch. But there's something else that happens in this system, and it's really related to how that cereal rye can suck up nitrogen. And what we have here is a situation where we have a legume cash crop going into a grass cover crop. And I feel like that's really important for that compatibility. We see that in this system, the cereal rye can really tie up quite a bit of nitrogen. And that is good for our soybean production because that gives the soybean, which is a legume, a competitive advantage over weeds. If some people in the past have looked at trying to fertilize, provide extra nitrogen for their cereal rye cover crop, thinking that they need a lot of biomass and that they're not going to get it unless they put down some nitrogen. And when we have done that in the past, we see that, yes, you can grow more biomass, but you also grow more weeds. And so, this thing about tying up nitrogen, I think is underappreciated oftentimes. And the compatibility between the legume cash crop and the grass cover crop is something that I think we need to pay a little bit more attention to. With corn, one problem that I've seen is where organic farmers have tried to no-till plant corn into rolled cereal rye. And they do that. There are good reasons for thinking that might be a good idea. Certainly cereal rye can be planted later than hairy vetch. But what you're doing is basically no-till planting a grass into a grass cover crop when you do it that way. And there are a number of problems in addition to the nitrogen drawdown and the nitrogen deficit problem. But just having that grass, you're increasing the potential for some pathogens and for some negative plant soil feedbacks from having that grass on top of a grass like that. So if you are working with a farmer or if you're thinking about doing this yourself and you really want to grow organic no-till corn, we encourage you to really think about using hairy vetch for that. Hairy vetch is a winter annual legume cover crop, and it matches up. It's much more compatible with corn than with cereal rye for organic no-till corn production. So even with the cereal rye or the hairy vetch that can provide quite a bit of nitrogen for that corn crop, farmers that have been successful with this system in Pennsylvania and other places, they often supplement the hairy vetch with manure or compost prior to seeding that hairy vetch. Certainly with this system, if you have any nutrient deficiencies, particularly phosphorus and potassium, it's really good to get that on before you plant your cover crop. It's a bit of a hassle to try to apply amendments over top of that mulch. So, and then mixtures. Some people have looked at mixtures of hairy vetch and rye, and there are some potential benefits of that. In my experience, we've seen better results with going with straight hairy vetch for this particular system with organic no-till corn. So very important to emphasize that this is a systems approach that we're taking with this research. Um, I feel like for farmers that really want to do this, it takes a change in the operation, really requires advanced planning. And I think it's important to think about this and as a system that is really beneficial, where it's beneficial to use adaptive management. Okay. There's also equipment considerations, getting a no-till planter or a front-mounted cover crop roller. So those are some things that, if you don't have them, they're really beneficial to have if you want to implement this type of system. We've seen different pest complexes with this type of management compared to traditional tillage-based production. We have different weeds that are often found in our fields where we're using no-till practices like this. One of the worst weeds that we've experienced is common ragweed, and that's because it actually it emerges early before the cover crop is rolled down, particularly cereal rye, and then it survives the rolling process, and then it'll come up through the mulch. We also see problems with perennial weeds, so some things to watch out for there. Early season insect pests can also be a problem. Without seed treatments, organic farmers are often forced to, if they do run into problems, basically their option is to replant. So sometimes we see fewer problems on organic farms for various reasons. In other cases, if the timing is just right and there's a bad infestation, again, the solution really is the only option is either to plow it up and do something different or to replant and hope for the best there. But that really takes some careful monitoring and you have limited time usually when you figure out that there is a problem. So I want to just introduce this timeline when I was talking about advanced planning, and it really need to be thinking about your no-till soybean production almost a year in advance here. And so I'd like to just emphasize that, starting early with your drilling cereal rye oftentimes into bare soil. Okay, that is really when things start. And so if you don't hit this window here, and that's really late August, early September, you don't want to be drilling your rye into November, because you're just not going to get the weed suppression that you need for this system to work. So I'd like to say late August, early September. And so fitting into a crop rotation that's typically after a small grain. So after wheat harvest, for example, or after a summer annual forage crop like sorghum Sudan grass. Occasionally, we think it can also work after corn silage, but certainly not after corn grain. Okay. And then this is what we're looking for in early spring: good ground cover. Ideally, you wouldn't see any soil. You would have good complete ground cover. And then in early spring, April, May, when we get into May, we're looking for the anthesis stage. So when you're seeing pollen being shed from the cereal rye cover crop, that's when you can consistently kill it with that mechanical termination from the roller crimper. So no-till planting, soybean emergence, and then harvesting basically a year after, more than a year after you started with the cereal rye planting. Okay. The planting date for your cereal rye, as I was mentioning earlier, is really important. So these photographs are taken on April 1st. This is in Pennsylvania, but there were 6 different planting dates here, and you can see a huge difference in just ground cover and also weed suppression from August 25th to October 15th here. And you don't see many weeds in here at all across all these plots, but we know based on other research that when you have this ground cover here, that is when you're getting really good weed suppression. And when you have gaps in the soil and you can see the soil like this is when you're not going to have as much cereal rye biomass, and you're going to have more weeds that are emerging between the rows of that cereal rye that was drilled in. Timing is important in the spring as well with that termination of the cereal rye cover crop. Here in this experiment, this was the reduced tillage organic systems experiment at Rock Springs in Penn State that I was part of. What you're looking at over here on the left is a soybean that was, and cereal rye that was rolled too early. You can see the soybean that has emerged here, but there was a lot of bounce back, so that the roller crimper was not effective when that cereal rye was rolled there. Over here, this is when it was rolled later, and you see that effective termination. Okay, so that's one of the potential limitations. There are researchers now that are looking into going in and getting your soybean planted early, or maybe earlier than you would normally do it in this system. Planting, no-till planting into standing cereal rye, and then coming back later after soybeans have emerged and then rolling that cover crop down. So that is an active area of research. We're very interested in that. We're working on a new project with Aaron Silva out at the University of Wisconsin, trying to nail that down and see what kind of yield benefits you might be able to get by going in and planting your soybean a little bit earlier and coming back later and terminating your cereal rye cover crop. Previous research that we've done at the Musgrave Research Farm is looked at different cover crop species. We've been talking about cereal rye mostly. We also looked at barley. Barley, the idea there was that it should reach anthesis a little bit earlier, and we might be able to mechanically terminate it earlier. And although we were able to effectively terminate barley a little bit earlier than cereal rye, it did not produce as much biomass, and we did not have as good of soybean yields. So here we have 4 different planting dates, ranging from May 22nd to June 12th. Okay, and then we have soybean yield on the y-axis. You can see the different data here across these 3 different cover crop species. So cereal rye in the middle here and triticale both performed very well and better than the barley. We did see, again, earlier planting dates did have a higher soybean yield, and that's part of the motivation with working with Aaron in Wisconsin to try to nail down this this alternative management approach of going in and establishing or planting, no-till planting your soybean before that cereal rye is ready to be terminated, and coming back later and rolling it down after soybean emergence. So photograph here, this is a very thin stand of cereal rye. Typically, we would not want to see so much soil with that mulch, but this is right at the edge, and certainly much more cereal rye biomass than barley biomass over here. And you can see what happened in terms of weed suppression. Barley just was not anywhere near as suppressive as the cereal rye. The other thing that's happening, that could be happening here, is cereal rye is known to be allelopathic. There are compounds that are released from cereal rye as it's decomposing that have been shown to be weed suppressive. So diboa is the name of that compound, and although there's been a lot of work done on allelochemicals, allelopathy in cereal rye, a lot of that work has been done in laboratories or in greenhouses. And when researchers have oftentimes have taken that work out into the field, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint and to attribute those effects to allelopathy. But we know that there's a combination of effects here. It's that physical suppression of the mulch, potentially some allelopathy, the drawdown of nitrogen that's happening, with cereal rye compared to other cover crops. We also looked at other cultural practices for optimizing production. One of those was soybean planting rates. And so you can see here just the effect of increasing the soybean planting rate from 80,000 seeds per acre up to 315,000 seeds per acre. And that may seem like an excessively large high seeding rate there. But when we look at the economics, we see that there's some potential for using high seeding rates to increase shading and to facilitate canopy closure and suppress weeds. Here with this crabgrass that you can see here, this is down in Hurley, New York at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. Striking differences between the low and the highest seeding rates here. Again, looking at partial returns. So this is an economic analysis here. We see soybean planting rates across the x-axis. These are two different sites that we were looking at. And we saw that certainly compared to the standard recommended planting rate for conventional soybean, around 130,000 seeds per acre, we're seeing our maximum partial returns at close to double that, or more than double that in this case of the second experiment. So really interesting. It's a totally different system. And the reason why we're seeing this, well, one, the soybean market value of that soybean crop is often higher because of the premium price for organic soybean compared to conventional soybean. And then conventional soybean seed actually costs more. When you're using traded seed, and that's really what's common now is to use traded seed. Compared to organic production, organic seed is actually less expensive. And so those two factors really create this big difference between conventional, the recommended rate in conventional, and what we considered our recommended rate based on these data for this organic no-till soybean system. So still, there's quite a bit of work to be done. Fitting it into a rotation, is a challenge for some farmers. So establishing cereal rye on time, getting good biomass production in the spring. We've also seen some issues with dry conditions before and after soybean planting, and I'll show you some data related to that. These early season insect pests that I was talking about, they can be attracted to the mulch, they can be problematic. And sometimes it's really difficult to manage for those because they are sporadic. They're not there all the time. It's hard to predict what year you're going to have a problem. Certainly crop rotation can help for some of those things, but in some cases they're coming in, they're not overwintering here, they're coming in on storm fronts, and it's just can be challenging. So equipment, I also mentioned earlier. So with adaptive management, this is a kind of a decision tree that we've developed for organic no-till soybean, and it really starts, with field selection. You want to avoid fields that are really problematic, that have a high soil weed seed bank or have a very high population of perennial weeds. If you have a field, if that's what the field is, I'd say go and do something different. Don't try this organic no-till soybean system because you're going to set yourself up for failure. At green up in the spring, if your cereal rye looks good and it's dense and uniform and weed free, then okay, that sounds good. You should proceed. If you see a lot of gaps in the mulch, and you can see soil and you see already weeds coming up and emerging, that's a critical decision point. And we're basically saying that you should be really thinking about terminating the cereal rye with tillage and doing something different. Don't, again, set yourself up for failure. If you already know at that point early in the spring, before cereal rye jointing, when you can actually manage it still, do something different. Don't set yourself up for failure with the no-till soybean system. And then the other thing is, right before planting soybean, right before planting, you have a good sense, has it been dry? And then you can also check your extended forecast. If it's been extremely dry and that rye has just been sucking out soil moisture, it's bone dry and there's no rain in the forecast, we have seen that it's actually better to just wait. It's really difficult to plant into that concrete hard soil that you get with cereal rye, and your soybean seed is just going to sit there. So either wait for rain, or we say harvest for grain, and that's an option for a lot of organic farmers that are seeding cereal rye. A lot of them are also growing small grains such as wheat, and that may be a better option than going in and planting no-till planting soybean and having the soybean be stunted because of dry conditions. What we're looking at here are some data comparing tilled soybean to no-till soybean. And this is soybean yield across different years, okay? And we see this largest yield gap. So here, very little yield gap, okay? More of a yield gap, more of a yield gap. And so in some years, the no-till system matches the tillage-based system. In other years, there's a huge yield gap. And so when we started to look at this, we saw a very strong correlation between the yield gap, okay, and the precipitation, the rainfall in that month right, 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after our planting. And so we're very interested in this, and we're thinking about decision support tools and how to alert farmers that they should be thinking about an alternative to no-tilling their soybeans into rolled rye. And again, that's that last decision point based on spring weather conditions. Typically in the past, I feel like moisture during the spring is not an issue. Oftentimes we have too much rainfall. But lately, we have seen some years where it's been really problematic. So 2018, in particular 2016, those are, when we had very, very dry spring conditions, and that's what's really driving that yield gap because of the moisture use from the cereal rye just prior to soybean planting. One of the decision support tools that we think could be really useful here is this tool, the water deficit calculator from the Climate Smart Farming Group here at Cornell. And you can see in 2015 at planting, and you can look at a tool like this and say, okay, we're in pretty good shape. We're not really in deficit conditions. However, in 2016, you're in trouble here because of not only just dry conditions, but also, again, that cereal rye sucking up soil moisture. So this is not field specific in the sense that it doesn't take into account the moisture reduction from the cereal rye, but it can give you a sense for how much rain that you've received and whether or not you might be getting yourself into trouble. I'll just show you a picture here, okay, and give you something to think about for a second. We have this difference, in this in a field trial, 2 different treatments. One on the right, very good soybean production. One on the left, very poor soybean production. Okay, and so this was this year, and I want to just show you. This is really due to a difference in seeding depth. And you may think, okay, well, no farmer in the right mind would no-till plant their soybean at a 1/4-inch seeding depth, but sometimes when it's dry, it's difficult to get into the mulch. That's what you wind up with. So having a good planter and good equipment where you can actually get the seed, get good soil seed contact, good seed placement, that's going to be critical. You get much better results, better soybean growth and better weed suppression from the shading from the better soybean growth here. I want to just highlight that there's a video that where we go through our planter that we use. We're using a no-till planter, relatively new no-till planter that's equipped with some different components that really help us get good seed placement. And so here's a link to the video. This is going to be Chris Pelzer, my lab manager, who's going to talk through our different components. I think I'm running out of time, but just wanted to highlight a couple other options. What you're looking at here is an inter-row mower, and we think that we might be able to do some additional work with organic no-till production using this inter-row mower. In the past, when we have had weed escapes, we've looked at high residue cultivation, but that's really difficult when you want to maintain that mulch on the soil surface. So we had a inter-row mower custom built for us. And we have not yet tried this. It was just delivered last month. And so we're gearing up for some research next season. But that's going to be something that's done in collaboration with some folks down at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. We'll be looking at a weed zapper for controlling weed escapes and for providing supplemental weed control. Some work with Sarah Bridge up in Geneva. We've seen that the rolled rye system can also be very effective at suppressing white mold in both soybean and dry bean. And some new research that we're doing is looking at other crops that we can use for no-till production, including wheat and sunflower that are no-till planted into rolled crimped cover crops. And so I have some additional slides, but I think I'm out of time. Joseph, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I'll be able to get into our organic no-till wheat. If you are interested in any of that, I have a whole nother slide deck here and some really interesting results about our experience with no-till planting, no-till drilling organic wheat into rolled crimped cover crops. But I think we'll just have to save that for next time.